Today, we get to talk about fear and domination, or we can talk about love and generosity. Those are our two
Right.
opposing sides of things. And I know which one we would rather talk about and where we need to spend much of our time, but I wanted to start with that fear and domination. Because how many can really see it very easily in someone outside of yourself? And you see how they're reacting to fear. You see how they're trying to dominate. You see those negative things. The question is really, can we see it in ourselves? Because we want to think that that we are people of love, that we are people of generosity. And most of the time we are. But you might have noticed that your friend of a different persuasion, politically or religiously, may not always see you as being loving or generous. Have you noticed that? And you may not understand why they think that, but it's important that we all are aware of the fact that some of what we do causes them to not feel loved. Right? At one point he said that what people are trying to do is push for liberation, and our job, our task is to support each other in that push. So I want you to think of somebody that you're having a hard time with in the world. And it can be somebody who's very close to you, or it could be somebody like a President Trump who does lots of things. And how is it that you are supporting them in the push for, first of all, how can you recognize their push for liberation in the midst of what may look like terrible behavior to you?
And I'd like to ask, what do we mean by liberation?
That's a good question, because I think it's very multifaceted. And sometimes, Diane, the problem is that I'm looking for my liberation, but at your expense. You kind of dealt with that mid chapter somewhere. But liberation is an important thing to see. But if I'm going to question their push for liberation, it's good if I'm in relationship with them, so that I can say, are you sure that that's the best thing to be searching for, or the best way to be able to become free? So where is it that you see someone that you disagree with and you're trying to understand their push for liberation? And when I ask that question, recognize that you may see that person because they're fearful from your point of view. They're trying to dominate. They're trying to push their agenda. They're trying to act like only their concerns matter, right? But how is it that you can see in them something more than just that? Go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, interesting exchange with the nurse practitioner, whom I like a lot and is very, very committed to our health, is compassionate, listens carefully when we describe any symptoms, makes appropriate referrals, all of these kinds of things. But I happened to mention something about relief from tension after the election, at which time she started a real harangue about saying, first of all, that the fact that there really was no fraud committed. She was glad about that. It was a fair election, but President Trump did not do anything to cause the January 6th attack. In fact, he asked people to be to not be violent, and that actually some of the people that were involved were Antifa people. And then began to talk about blacks in Chicago. The whole time I'm sitting there thinking, this is a woman who cares for me well, and I love her.
Yeah.
And thinking there is nothing I can say that's going to change her because she has launched into this diatribe. Finally, we came to a point where there was kind of a breathing space, I guess. And I said, well, we really want the best that we can have for all of our people, you and I. And she said, yes. And I thought, oh, thank God, there's the common ground.
Yeah.
It was not a surprise. It was disappointing that she was so heavily into her belief system. But I thought there was a common ground point there.
Yeah.
And it felt like it rescued the moment.
Good. Good. The good news is, Diane, is that you have some unique qualifications to be able to be with her in that space. Because I remember sitting with you 4 years ago and the struggle of trying to understand that election, trying to make sense of what went horribly wrong from your perspective. And so you have some idea of what she's going through, even though it's in reverse. You have some idea of what it feels like to be empathetic, at least, of an election loss like that. And sometimes that's hard to be when you're busy being joyful, as you ought to be in this moment. But it's helpful that you have some of the same feelings if you choose to use them. And that's sometimes the hard part, right? Choosing to use.
Yeah.
Because you can't quite say, well, I felt the same way when you guys beat our guy.
Yeah.
Or our gal, I guess we should say.
Fraudulently.
Fraudulently, yeah. Trying to figure out how to be in those types of conversations, though, is part of the challenge, isn't it?
Well, and it wasn't a conversation. That was one of the things that was interesting. It was while we're sitting there, I realized I'm not going to say anything, but I'm sure my face reflected that I did not agree with what she was saying.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to say anything that will try to change her viewpoint.
Yeah.
But I know that she and I have common ground in terms of caring for people. That's what I see that she does.
Yeah. I'm trying to have that same kind of conversation, Diane, with a friend of mine named Nancy. Nancy and I have known each other for about 20 years now. She led one of my musical groups at First Church Phoenix. And we went on a mission trip to Ecuador together about 20 years ago. She's got a fine spirit, but right now she's definitely over in the conspiracy camp. So we've begun a conversation, and she sent me a list of conversation topics, I guess you could say, from a group. It's felt like a group at her church, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 type of thing. And you could guess some of the suspects. And I said, well, that's a lot. So I'm just going to answer 3 or 4 of them. And I tried to very clearly say, this is why I'm where I'm at. Not so much because that's the wrong thing, but because. So like on economy was number 1. And so I tried to say, this is why I'm a Democrat, because this is my perception of, Republican administrations, economy goes up and then crashes towards the end, where Democrats go up slower, but they maintain. So that's why I'm a Democrat. Now she's not going to like all my answers. She's going to have to figure out how to respond differently than, because I'm talking outside of the mode that she has. But trying to be in that space together is work for both people, isn't it? You know, how do you talk to that person who's obviously hurt when you're feeling joyful in the moment? How about the rest of you? Where are you dealing with all of this?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about what Sharon said last week about we need a new vocabulary when we talk to each other. And I've been so aware of a lot of people on the media saying we have to fight for this and we have to fight for that. I don't know whether work for that and work for this has the same power as fight, but it is obviously less combative. And it's, really clear to me that words do matter. And I spent a lot of time this week. Someone objected to my choice about something and more or less said I should never do that again. I'm 83. Chances of my doing that again are maybe not all that apparent or, obvious, but my first response was, well, I'm going to do it again right now.
I've had that kind of response too, Judy.
Oh, yeah, it's just automatic. Like, you tell me what to do, I'm going to do the opposite. And, that's pretty ridiculous at this age too. But so I was really stumbling about how to word my response and really put it off, and then got asked the same thing again. So I had to use a friend as a sounding board to even get started with a reply, because my first responses are really sassy. They're really not good unless I want to fight, and I usually don't want to fight.
Yeah. But just know, Judy, that at least part of what I feel like he's saying in this chapter is you come by that honestly. We all come by that honestly. That part of the story of our country, of the space that we live in politically and culturally and well, in all different ways, is that we have a story of survival of the fittest. And it's all about competition and against each other, and that's part of who we are. Now we can choose to keep telling that story, or we can also tell the second story that he's trying to bring us to. And I think most of this book is going to help us to figure out how to make that transition more and more to that second story. The hard part is that sometimes it's this first story that's easiest in the moment, isn't it? If the person coming towards us seems to have a raised knife or a raised Bible to be used as a weapon, it's hard not to react with your own weapon back. Right? Especially the more that we are convinced that what we're doing is really what's going to change the world. But what we're doing that's going to change the world is not beat them in a battle. Right? And so if we battle them in order to get our way of love brought forward, we're kind of counterproductive to our own thought pattern, isn't it? And yet that's the easiest thing to do. It's almost natural. Here comes their weapon, so we pull out ours.
I was really interested in that, how he suggested that everyone is kind of on a continuum of that, Jim, based on life experiences. That was helpful to me in thinking about how I respond to people, to recognize they're acting out of their life experiences and their level of trust and trust versus fear, just as I am, for sure. I mean, I have a really hard time trusting people, and I have a lot of fear toward conservatives. I've shared a story in another setting. We were in Pine, Arizona for a little trip, and all the Trump Pence signs were out during that time. And I turned to Greg and I said, does this make you feel sort of afraid? Because I just felt like we were in this like land of Trump, just this, it felt scary to me. So it's like, I get those emotions rising up. And then he suggests that where we put our attention is what grows that in us. And I was reminded of that story that everybody probably knows about, the Native American story about, I have within me the wolf of peace and love, and I have the wolf inside of me of, despair and anger. And the grandson says, well, which one wins? Asked the Native American grandfather, which one wins? And he says, the wolf that you feed the most.
Yeah.
It's like, I feel like I am so drawn to feeding my anger and my fear right now. I am addicted to the media. Even today, I was realizing I'm looking at CNN, and all the stories I go to are ones with little headlines that give me a hint that, oh, this is something bad about conservatives I can read. And I'm not drawn to the ones that are about some nurse somewhere who did something wonderful, not nearly as much. And I just realized I'm feeding the wrong wolf, to develop this worldview that he's talking about, I think is a conscious decision to where we put our attention.
So why is it that we so often feed the wolf of fear? Why is that an easier path to go down for us?
There's a lot of psychological research that's been published that says people view loss as far more weighty on their well-being than they view gain. And, I think it's because the animal inside of us knows that to die is far more final than to, have something good happen. So, we come by it honestly, but it permeates our being in ways that aren't helpful.
Yeah. I kind of hate that he was honest about religion in here. Although, later he said that we can also be the purveyors of that other story about love and generosity, that very often we have definitely bought into the stories of fear and domination. And that much of what we've done has been that easier route of scaring people into heaven, scaring people into doing the right thing, because it's simpler, right? It's kind of the just wait till your father comes home that scare the kid into being good, rather than trying to sit and help the kid become who, that's a much harder and less, the one changes things immediate back to something else, and the other takes some time. Fear works, right?
Well, yeah, that's what our parents told us.
Yeah. Doesn't mean that it's good in the long term, but in the short term, it is really easy to use.
And maybe if our animal response is to respond quickly, especially if we're attacked or our ideas are attacked, and then if we take the breath and step back from it and decide rationally whether this is the space we want to be in with this person, but that's counterintuitive to what we're in a way programmed biologically to do, because that's what we do is protect ourselves, and to the point of protecting our ideas too.
Yeah.
So that it's almost like there has to be a retraining.
Almost like there has to be. I think that idea of protection is a really important one to explore, because what are we protecting, we have to ask, and what are we protecting it from? And then the inevitable why. Why do I think that Kay is going to take away my protection somehow? Why do I look at her and see some reason why she is fear invoking to me, right? So that I have to protect myself from her. But what story do I tell inside of that?
You know, I've been thinking in relation to this of that old bestseller. I think it was 30 or 40 years ago. I'm okay, you're okay. You remember?
Sure.
And he had the diagram of the two sets of three circles facing one another, and it was parent, adult, child, parent, adult, child.
Eric Byrne.
And he said, we typically, you know, if we're dominators, we play the parent and view the other as our subordinate. And if we are timid, then we submit and view others as stronger than us. But the healthiest, most satisfying relationship is equal to equal or adult to adult.
Yeah.
But that means we have to feel equal, not just see the other as equal. It's when we feel threatened that we see the other as the enemy. You know?
And I think key to that, Greg, is some sense of trust, not just in that other person, but in ourselves.
Mhm.
Because if I'm sitting as the child to their parent, it's because I'm not trusting myself completely.
Mhm.
And I have to somehow work to be able to truly trust that other person. But think of some of the people you've loved, but you weren't quite able to tell them this thing, that you knew that whatever that this phrase was would be a hard one for them to hear. But to truly step into that space of love, you have to be able to say those kinds of phrases, have those kinds of discussions, even when they're fear invoking between the two of you, because you have to trust more than fear. Go ahead, Judith.
When you said about coming at you with a weapon or the Bible and then talked about training, what came to my mind was martial arts, the way they use the aggressor's energy to dissuade it. I don't have any training there, but seeing things on TV, I was thinking that would be a useful thing to be trained in if we could do that, so that the energy would be turned in a different direction.
Yeah. But I think that takes very intentional other ways of battling. Have you ever done that experiment where you stand with your hands next to, you stand facing another person, you put your hands up, and almost automatically you start pushing on each other's hands?
Hmm.
Have you ever seen that? And what happens if we stop pushing? The other person stops pushing as well. Sometimes because they fall, because they don't have our resistance. But we have an automatic kind of push that happens in life. And what if we don't give in to that? Now that sounds really simple. So I want you to go back to somebody like Judy's neighbor that we talked about last week. What happens when you're confronted with that neighbor who sure seems to be pushing you, or at least pushing your buttons? And that push becomes very natural. But at least part of what you and your neighbors did, Judy, is you said, in this place, this dog park, not going to do that. And so you took away the opposition from each other. Not just your opposition to them, but the reverse as well. So who do you, go ahead.
I like what Diane was saying about, taking that break before you respond, that moment. And that's so hard to do. We've been reading some Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks about empathic listening, where you just are listening and you're not there to correct the wrong thinking. You just want to make that person feel heard, like giving somebody that much space. I think that could be really healing, really difficult, but really necessary.
The difficult thing for me is because sometimes they are just so horribly wrong. It is hard sometimes to leave it lying, isn't it?
We are also, Sharon and I, reading again Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. And the bit we read this morning said that everything we hear from somebody else just about is an expression of feelings and need. And that if we could look for the feeling and need beneath whatever is offensive in the communication, that we're going to have more peace, and we're going to have more empathy, and we're going to have a more productive outcome. But it's so easy to take the literal surface of what others say to us and get triggered in some way that's not helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Especially,
think that's what I feel. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
no, you go right ahead.
I think that's what I feel when I think about those people on January 6th, charging into the chambers. These were the people who felt left out in everything else, and this was their action. I can remember 4 or 5 years ago reading a review of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy. And in there's something that struck me very deeply, that there's a whole batch of folk in the United States who feel completely left out. And the person who was writing the review said, now I understand why these people voted for Trump. And I think that's part of it. And that's part of my hurt in this.
Yeah.
That while I wanted to say, okay, get them out of there, shoot them, I don't care what you have to do. Down deep, there was that awareness that these people are hurting and they have no other way to express this.
And I agree with you, Harvey. That it is a remarkable book. If you haven't read that book, it's a good book to read, because it just is trying to say, why is it that some of America is the way some of America is? And he tries not to hold back on some of the dysfunctions of his family. He's pretty honest about many of them.
Yeah.
Just
But-
heard
Like
today
my
that he might
family.
run for political office, that author.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, he might run for political office.
Might at some point or another. It's an interesting thing to be able to get into the mind of someone who's very different. And it was very easy for me in that hillbilly to see the hillbillies of northern Arizona that are my family, and to understand some of how they were feeling more.
I think you also have there's some organizations out there who are also exploiting that fear
Mhm.
and that kind of alienation that a lot of people are feeling. And if you look into the history of white supremacy, it's not gone away since the founding of our country.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, I guess, there was a guy who, God, I can't remember his name right now, Larry somebody. And he got the first Commodore 64 computer before anybody else had them and stuff, and started messaging boards for other white supremacists around the country. And they started organizing. And a lot of what's happening now is they touched, I mean, Timothy McVeigh he was on these message boards with them,
Mhm.
and it's the reason, and they're able to militarize this fear. And the thing is like, I feel like I practice my loving kindness, and I do my meditations, and I live in my peaceful little world. And then then there's the wolf at the door. And and I think there's times when you've got to not, you can't just placate them. You know, you do have to like stand up for injustice. You have to stand up and say, enough.
Right.
This is enough. There's no more. Because if you don't, then, and it's so convoluted too, because then I look at like Trump. If we don't prosecute Trump, then future presidents are going to go, I can do absolutely anything and get by with it. They're not going to do anything to me.
Right.
But if we do prosecute him, then it's seen as a witch hunt and he becomes even more of a martyr. So it's like there's no good way to deal with it at all. And so it's just kind of like, I do read, Sharon, I read everything I can in the Times every morning on the nurses who are doing the good stuff. You know, it's like I listen to Tara Brach, I listen to my Buddhist teachers and stuff, and I do as much as I can. But then I also have to have in my head, there's a wolf at our door. And what are we going to do about the wolf?
Yeah. Well, the paragraph that I wrote down about this that I thought was very important about exactly what you're saying is where he says, no matter how loving and generous we are, it is sometimes rational to protect ourselves and our loved ones from these real dangers. Right? That is not an unfaithful move. That is not an unloving move, but it's going to feel like that. But then he goes on and says, knowing when such protection is rational and when it is a product of our own internal distortions or excessive fears takes careful discernment. Now, I'm going to show you some of my bias. I believe that your rightest friends are not going to have that kind of discernment. So in the moment, how do we help have a good conversation? First of all, I think we're going to have that discernment. And I think that we're going to have to try to figure out who on that side might have that same kind of discernment too. Because, okay, so if we look at the insurrectionists at the Capitol, many of my most conservative friends need to see that a line is drawn. They tend to be more black and white people. And if a line is not drawn of right and wrong, they're going to say, that was okay. That was right. And we need to figure out how to draw that line. And that's part of what discernment is about, is figuring out when and how to draw that line. And my natural response is to say, can I figure out a softer way? But sometimes you can't do that.
So if the people who actually did the attacking and the bombarding of the Capitol are going to be prosecuted, then I think it follows that Trump has to be held accountable at some level.
I agree.
Otherwise, we're falling into that same pattern of the rich get off easy.
But politically, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
It probably isn't, in all likelihood, from what I've been reading and listening to. I listened to a prosecutor talk about this yesterday, and it's like, you know, she was saying there's like 3 doors that we can prosecute Trump on. She said it's like a game show. The first door is his federal crimes, his incitement to riot, his trying to overturn the election and things. And then there's state crimes. And then the third door, and because we really don't think he's going to change his stripes, he's not going to change. It's his future crimes, the crimes he's still committing and going to commit. And it's like she said, the fact is that they're probably it's going to end up being not federal, but states that are going to end up prosecuting him, because the federal government probably not going to do it. Biden, when he comes out and says when you want unity, it's like, let's just push this aside and let it go. Let's just get over it and forget it and keep going. And I think and the further we get from it, it's only been 2 weeks or 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks or something. And already people are less agitated than they were the day after. And I think we're going to see, it's not going to, I think it's going to be this, I think New York State's going to go after him more than anybody.
I agree with you.
But it's, you know, it's not going to be the, I don't think the Senate has the, I don't think they have the political will to do it, which is sad, but it's, you know, it's like, you still have to worry about, I mean, that's the senators who voted for him. I mean, the House representatives who voted for impeachment have gotten huge blowback from Trump supporters and from his base and stuff. I mean, they've gotten death threats and stuff, you know, and there, another senator has quit because he said, you know, it's too toxic in the Senate right now. It's like, it's just really, part of it I have to let go of because it's like I can't do anything about it. So I try and stay on top of the biggest part of the news and stuff. But at some point then I have to go into something that's, I look out my door and go, okay, the hummingbirds are still feeding on my nectar. You know, my dog is still happy. I'm safe. Nobody's like running up and down in front of my apartment with guns. And meditate on that for a while and focus in on, I think there's a whole lot of good being done in this country. I think there is. I've seen different areas of groups that are based. I've seen 3 different groups now based on revolutionary love, besides this one. Yeah. And that gives me hope because there is a groundswell of people now who are going, this domination model is not working.
Right.
So there has to be something else.
Let's see what you're
And I
talking
think
about.
that's coming about.
What you're talking about, Judy, is what he dealt with at the end of the chapter, and that was the section about social energy. How do we take this moment and make it so that the social energy moves us one direction rather than another? And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see where some of those manipulators on the right are going to try to drag it this way. I can't affect what they do. We can also, though, tell a different story. And I liked how he essentially used our last 2 presidents, or I should say the 2 presidents before our last president, President Obama and President Bush, and he said, what could have happened? And I agree with him. When I look at President Obama, and I understand why he sometimes took the cautious route that he took, but he sometimes took that in a way that was very frustrating towards the better goals, I believe. Right? And he didn't allow hope to be as a shining of a light as what I wish he could have. But on 9/11, when he talks about George Bush and he does that whole big section of what if our president had said something like this?
Yeah.
Because it was a horrible day. And we ended up, I track back to there to see much of the divisions of today. So 20 years ago, I think that we're facing the result of how we reacted to that day, because we chose to ultimately react more in fear than look how amazing we are. Right? What can we make of ourselves because of this? And how do we tell that type of story? How do we, in the midst of this crisis, begin to tell the story of, look what America is going to become? I think that's what President Biden is trying to do, right? Now, there's a sizable part of the population that's not buying that at all. Some of them are your friends and neighbors and family.
Yep.
How are you going to try to tell that message of hope? That different story?
Yeah, I think sometimes people have been so grounded in needing to be the dominant one that it's very, very hard. Um, um, the rabbi mentions how Rousseau gives a different view of what human nature is or could be. And there is that which wants us to reach out to our neighbors and help those rather than to say, okay, we're going to wipe them out. And I think that's very important. I can give you so many personal examples of that, but I won't do that right now. But that's the key, that we've been so grounded in that message. You got to stick up for yourself. You got to fight for yourself. You got to make your place or you're going to be ground under, that we forget that other nature of us.
The last couple of days, Harvey, last couple of weeks, I've been watching a whole bunch of different little Westerns, right? And you know, the answer always in the Western is to smack the other guy in the nose. Always, right? That's the first reaction. And I think about that, and I think about anybody who is older than me grew up much more on those Westerns than what I did. And so that was the story that many of my 70-year-old, 80-year-old, 90-year-old friends, that was what they grew up seeing as, of course, that's what you do. How do we start telling a different story?
It's awfully hard.
Yeah.
Awfully hard. And let me share a quick thing. The thing about the quote from the section on Rousseau reminded me that my great aunt used to teach at Columbia University in New York. And so she's a very bright person, and she had this financial advisor, and she was trying to get some answers from this financial advisor. And he said, well, don't you understand this? This is so, you ought to be able to understand this. So she reaches in her book bag and pulls out this copy of this book by Rousseau and said, this is what I teach. And the guy begins to look through it and says, I don't understand it. I just don't understand it.
And trying to figure out where that is true between us is important, isn't it?
You know, I think this whole divide is between conservatives and not conservatives has a heavy element around education.
Right on.
If you look at the last Republican presidents, it was Trump and George W., both of whom were famous for being not very articulate, or Trump doesn't read, and
Right.
W put his foot in his mouth continuously, but he was the guy you'd want to have a beer with, right? And this whole thing about elitists, a lot of us are shocked because it's the wealthy who are benefiting from conservative voters, but I think it's really the educated, the professors and the journalists who are the heroes of the center and the left. But anyway, I think we do. I used to work with people with developmental disabilities who were the least able to have academic accomplishment. And I noticed during those years how often people in public, locally, nationally, always talk about getting a college education is the most important thing. And there are so many people who don't get a college education and probably feel demeaned by us always holding up going to college as a marker of success. So anyway, in terms of compassion toward Trump voters and whatnot, I think looking at ourselves around, not disproportionately valuing or devaluing people around this thing of education is important.
I think what you're getting into is really asking ourselves the hard questions about why it is that I am the way I am and why they are the way they are. And he put that set of 4 questions there to help us to do that. And I think those were great questions, great types of questions for us to try to figure out, how is it that my past is speaking louder than what I think it's speaking? How is it that other person's past is speaking very loudly? All of that stuff is important for us to understand if we're truly going to communicate as well as what we can. So if I can, I'll just kind of summarize the questions. How much of your schooling and everything was nurturing or destructive,
So Dr. Kemp,
right? And where is it that your stuff was destructive? What teachers did you have that somehow
I'm online in a Zoom class.
spoke
Thank you.
down, got in the way of, and how much did you get lifted up by those teachers, even when you didn't deserve it? So the second question is, what are your adult relationships like? Are you in loving and relationships that tell you how wonderful you are, or are you in relationships that use you, see you in some kind of utilitarian way? The third question are, what are the ideas to which you've been exposed in school? Right? And I think sometimes about school, I look at the way some people teach school, and what they're doing is they're busy teaching small concepts. I love better the teachers that are expansive concept type of people. But that's harder to do that because that's less measurable. And then the last question is, how have you experienced societal energies when they tilt toward fear or hope? And sometimes we can see some of those things. We can all look at 9/11 and see the societal energies around that. But what is it that it did to you versus what did it do to me?
You know, I was really intrigued in his intro. He talked about how the conservatives have developed these colleges that are kind of training people to think in that worldview, and how that liberals have sort of abandoned that kids are not getting. For me personally, my exposure to education had a huge impact on who I became. I was really fortunate. I mean, I came from a racist, very small world family. And you know, the exposure I had to different kind of thinking was through great teachers. And I'm talking from elementary on. I had really people that taught me to think and think critically, which I think is so essential in liberal arts right now. But he talked in the intro about how that now college has become about getting a job. And so that students are not even exposed to the liberal arts classes that help them learn critical thinking, and how that he felt like he wanted to challenge Democrats to put money toward, you know, teaching about worldview rather than policies, you know, that more like what conservatives have done. And to me, that would be impacting this, what was it called in this chapter? The social, what was it, Will?
Social
or what?
energy.
Yeah, the social energy. To me, that's you know, how kids are taught totally impacts social energy.
And if it's a very small vision that education is giving to you, it's hard to educate yourself out of that if you're stuck too much into that only this much can be seen. That was the environment I basically grew up in. It's not that it was a bad environment, but it only saw this much and literally didn't see beyond the blinders that said this is the truth. And I had people friends of mine, women who were literally being abused, but could not figure out how to step away from that abuse because of how much this was the only idea. And all of that would have allowed them to step away was outside of that.
One of the things I think we need to keep alert about is that, and of course, this is someone speaking from the 60s, where we thought so much change was permanent. So much human and social justice change was permanent. And it's not permanent. And we have to keep being alert to where it's gets frayed and eaten at around the edges, and make sure that we keep working for the things that we worked for all our lives. We just keep doing it. And the other piece of it is, I think we need to tell more of the positive stories about what people are doing, because this is in a way an age of despair, and we cannot give in to that. Judy talking about hearing some stories about what people were doing to actually help each other. I think this is what we need to give language to now. It not only makes us feel more empowered, but it might be the way we can tell conservatives that some good things are happening because some good people are working for the benefit of others.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with that statement, I'm going to have to go because I've got another promise to make. But gee, it's sure great to be able to be with you and to pontificate here.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm gonna when you're as you leave, I'm gonna keep talking about the same thing, because there were some marvelous things that he said in there about depression being on an uptick right now. What we've talked about in email about childhood suicides rise is
right.
important. There's a lot of where our society right now is taking on some very, very malignant edges like that, where it's not just the individual that's being damaged, but we as a society are
Yeah.
suffering from.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Blessings to all of you.
Bye, Diane.
Bye,
Bye.
Diane. Love you, sweetie.
Thank you.
And I think some of that depression that he talked about that psychotherapists are seeing, that's not just individual mental illness. And we don't have any way to be able to measure societal mental illness, but we are doing things that make it easier to go down those paths. At least in my mind, part of the reason why some of the right is going where they're going is because they're seeing things in dysfunctional ways. They won't recognize that, although they will be able to recognize easier how you guys are dysfunctional and the paths you're taking are wrong. And can we hear that voice across party lines that allows me to see some of the things that I'm doing to add to their dysfunction, or they're doing to add to my dysfunction? Can we hear that about each other? It's hard work. Catherine, you look like you have something to say.
Well, I'm thinking about this because I'm thinking about the educational part, and that's just one piece, because when I think about myself, having had various kinds of education in different parts of the country, growing up in the Midwest and then going to some college there, and then actually taking some classes up in Alaska and finishing my bachelor's degree in Arizona and then my master's degree. But I also think it has to do with experience. If you're insular, I see a big difference between some people that I know of, and they're really very nice and lovely people, and some of them are even family. And they've gotten out in the sense that they have traveled somewhat, but they have lived basically in the Midwest, or they've lived in one area of the country. And I am thinking that it's got to be multifaceted, the way that we deal with some of this, because we can have book learning and we can read things and we can have education, and then we have to kind of play with it, and we have to see if it fits or it works, or is it true what I learned in classes? And I always thought maybe some of the problem with some of the people that taught me was that they were academics, and it's not that that's a horrible sin or crime, but but maybe it is. But that I wanted people that had real life experience, that weren't just talking theoretically, I wanted people that had life experience that maybe got them to see things in a more open manner.
And the tough part about education, of course, is that, as he tried to point out, sometimes the authorities that are teaching us, whether it's religion or Western political philosophy or modern social science, sometimes they are teaching a philosophy of fear and domination. So that's not, those authorities, no matter how well we've spoken them through the years or how much they've given clarity in some ways, may not always be the most definitive if we're trying to move towards a motion of love, right? If that's what we're looking for, we have to decide which ones are most helpful in that conversation.
Well, when I hear you say that, I realize that human beings can use any strength as a way to dominate other people.
Mhm.
Mm.
Anything. And so we have to be careful that we don't use anything at our hand as a weapon over other people.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think our whole domination model and the whole way we are living our lives is like the article I shared with Diane this morning on suicides and especially around Las Vegas, since you know, it's like 8 and 9-year-olds are killing themselves. You know, 10-year-olds are killing themselves. And teenagers, I mean, this is an epidemic right now in our country. And that doesn't even count the opioid, you know, the fact of, so it's like, obviously the way we've been living isn't working.
Right.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that in the next chapter.
That's right. That's where we're moving towards. So let me finish with one last quote. He says, we should always ask ourselves, is this experience, communication, or message more likely to move me or most people who hear or see it toward fear and the conviction that everyone is selfish or hurtful or not to be trusted, or toward the trust in possibilities of a loving and caring world? That's one of his bottom line things here. How are we helping the second possibility to be true, not the first? Because how many know there's a bunch of things to be fearful of out there? A bunch of people you wish you didn't have to deal with and you could just push them away. But by pushing them away, you're not necessarily moving to a more loving space. And so in every moment, we have to ask ourselves, is my reaction drawing me one direction or the other? And I think that that's what he's trying to help us to figure out in this whole book, is how to make the loving direction be the way we are moving all the time. Now, Judy pretty much has that all figured out how to do that every time, every moment. Right,
That's Judy Robinson, not Judy West.
And I was just thinking the opposite. Thank you very much.
But I think that if we do this in community, we'll find more ways that we can move towards the one side instead of the other. All right. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate your conversation.
Thank you, Jim.
I will send you the next chapter if you don't have it yet.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.